Okay, welcome. We are now leaving Athens and walking with Paul the 60 or 70 miles south to Corinth. Corinth in Paul's day did not have quite the glorious past or the academic reputation that Athens had, but economically Corinth was a powerhouse. It was a hustling, bustling, rising city. In fact, the ancients had a saying, not everyone can afford to visit Corinth. The assumption being that if you were going to Corinth, you'd be spending money on food, spending money on drink, spending money on lodging, spending money on entertainment. So don't even think about going there unless you have a good wallet to start with. So that was the kind of city that Paul was. He comes there, as they say in Acts chapter 18, after having been in Athens, and spends a long time in Corinth. It's one of his major outreaches of that second missionary journey. So let's see if we can pull those slides up for you, and we'll be off on our way to Corinth with Paul. Okay, so this is Ephesus, and Paul has been up in northern Greece and then come down to Athens and Corinth. Western Asia Minor was one of the most prosperous and populous parts of the Roman Empire in Paul's day. There was a lot of traffic back and forth, particularly between Ephesus and Rome. A lot of goods flowing back and forth. Ships that were going from Asia Minor to Rome had two choices. One was going south around the Peloponnese and then up to Rome through its port of Ostia. But the weather was often difficult around the southern end of the Peloponnese, and these little coves also liked to harbor pirates. So many ship owners said, you know, let's just do the straight run across to Corinth, a quick transfer across the isthmus of Corinth, and then right to the ports and harbors on Rome, either here and then take the Appian Way, or again all the way around to Rome. So Corinth was very strategically located. All north-south traffic went through it, and a lot of the east-west traffic went through it, which really made for a prosperous economy. So here you can see the this was the largest excursion, the largest emphasis of Paul's second missionary journey. And later on his third missionary journey, he spent a lot of time in Ephesus, which was close enough by that he could write letters back and forth and even have some visitors back and forth and kind of continue to shepherd these folks in Corinth. So the Gulf of Corinth comes in from the west, and the Saronic Gulf from the east, and then this very narrow isthmus, which made all the land traffic go through the city of Corinth, and as I said, much of the maritime traffic also. You arrive in Corinth. You're struck immediately by the Temple of Apollo, built in the 5th or 6th century BC, very early in the classical age, and still standing today. Very impressive, dominates the city of Corinth. You can, simple Doric capitals, no capital bases, similar to the style of the Parthenon, a very simple pillar. The difference is that where the Parthenon columns are marble and they're stacked drums of marble, this is local stone and it's monolith. It's not stacked drums. It's one of the few things that the Romans left standing when they sacked Corinth in 146 BC. They left the Temple of Apollo. It had dominated the skyline at that point for 5 centuries and continues to dominate the skyline today. As I mentioned, the Romans had sacked Corinth in 146 BC. Corinth had been involved in an attempt to drive the Romans out, and as punishment for that, in 146 BC, the Romans really leveled Corinth, just smashed it to bits. For 100 years it was in ruins. In about 46 BC, Julius Caesar, who by that time had most of the powers of emperor, decreed that Corinth should be rebuilt. And so that was, by Paul's time, then that had been 100 years of what we call Roman Corinth, as distinct from Greek Corinth prior to 146 BC. So Roman Corinth was 100 years old and very, very hustling, bustling place. Shortly after the time of Paul's visit to Corinth, Nero visited Corinth on his way to the Olympian Games, where he was reading poetry. What's notable about this is that his head is covered, and that means he was in an attitude of prayer. Higher class Roman men covered their heads for prayer. You know that Jewish men covered their heads for prayer. And you might remember that Paul, in his letter to the church at Corinth, said men should pray with their heads uncovered. There's been a lot of interesting theories about why Paul says that, in contradistinction from the Jewish world and the Roman world. One of the more intriguing suggestions is that it was only upper class Roman men who were wearing the toga and therefore would have something to pull up over their heads as they prayed at the pagan altars. Lower class working people would not have been able to do that. Slaves would not have been able to do that. And so one intriguing suggestion is that Paul says all the men should pray with their heads uncovered, and it's a social leveling. You're all equal before the deity. So, but I show you this because it does factor in some ways into Paul's conversations in his letter to the church at Corinth. Another factor of life in Corinth is the clay. There are very nice deposits of high quality clay in Corinth, and so a lot of pottery produced, fine, small pottery like this. Also large pottery, large amphorae for transporting grain and olive oil and wine and so forth. This, of course, is part of the background for Paul's comment about we have this treasure of the gospel in earthen vessels or clay vessels. Okay, outside the museum for just a moment, we have been talking about Doric columns, and we talked about Ionic columns with the academic scrolls. This is the third type of column, the Corinthian column. And you'll see these on university campuses, not in the academic buildings, but in the administration buildings where the president's office is. It's the latest and most ornate and elaborate of the styles. You can see a base and then all the elaborate Corinthian capital. So just for your general edification. Okay, we've talked about Acropolis. Each city had its own Acropolis or high point. This is the Acropolis of Corinth, but it is so much higher than the rest of the city and somewhat separate from the rest of the city that it actually gets its own name. It's called the Acrocorinth. Could also be called the Acropolis of Corinth. We are standing at about 300 feet above sea level. That's about 1,800. So it's about a 1,500 feet elevation climb to climb up there, which brings into doubt the idea that all the sailors who came to visit Corinth would have walked to the top up there. That seems kind of unlikely, frankly. We are standing in the Agora, or the marketplace. Here's a little bit better view of the marketplace with the Temple of Apollo kind of dominating things. When you came to the marketplace, you would have stopped at the Temple of Apollo for just a moment to acknowledge him, maybe to give a little offering, and then go in shopping in the Agora. Sometimes when I have a live audience, I make a comment about the Greek citizens of Corinth and the Roman citizens of Corinth considered shopping to be a religious experience, and I usually get a chuckle from that one. So you can think about that. Maybe that's still true today for some people. Very, very large agora, one of the largest agoras in the ancient world, with the modern Christian church here, and we'll go over there for a moment. You can see again, here's current ground level. As I've mentioned before, you go down in the soil to go back in time to bring you back to the first century. But the modern Christians in Corinth have done something kind of special. They have put up a white pillar here, and they have engraved on that pillar a message to the world in 4 international languages. And they are saying that there's a letter, a biblical letter that came to us that we want to share with the world. And so they engraved on that white pillar some fragments, paragraphs from Paul's letter to them. And you've already guessed they chose love is patient, love is kind, love is not arrogant or boastful, and so forth, from 1 Corinthians 13. There's that temple of Apollo again. These are the shops of the Corinth, in the ancient agora or marketplace. One of these shops belonged to a young couple named Aquila and Priscilla. They're Jewish folks who were followers of Jesus, who had left Rome and moved to Corinth about 49 AD. So they'd been here for a year or two when Paul arrived. They were tent makers or leather workers by trade, as Paul was, and so he joined them. And he worked with them in the leather working trade or the tent making trade, and then also they supported his ministry of preaching Christ here in Corinth. And it's kind of fun to just walk around here and try to guess which one of these shops actually they would have worked in. It's just very fun. So a little, Paul wrote 2 letters to the church at Corinth. In fact, if I must say so, of all the churches that Paul founded and pastored, the church at Corinth was the one that gave him the most sleepless nights and the most headaches, but that did not deter him from a determined, positive approach to them. A few verses from 1 Corinthians 1. I always thank my God for you because of his grace given you in Christ Jesus. For in Jesus you have been enriched in every way, God thus confirming our testimony about Christ among you. So he is resolutely positive, even as he writes to this very dynamic and sometimes troubled church. And maybe the secret of that is in verse 9. God is faithful, who has called you into fellowship with his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. That little phrase, God is faithful, kind of echoes through Paul's 2 letters to the church at Corinth. And maybe it was him kind of reminding himself and reassuring himself that somehow the Lord is going to pull this even somewhat troubled church through to the end. And certainly, because of their questions and uncertainties, we have wonderful teaching. He wrote to them extensively, and so we have a lot of detail about the Lord's Supper, about the gifts of the Spirit, about the fruit of the Spirit, about the resurrection, and about Paul's apostolic ministry. That's particular 2 Corinthians. And part of what he says in 2 Corinthians is, for this slight momentary affliction that I am going through is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. And then a little bit later in 2 Corinthians, we find out what that slight momentary affliction is. I'm in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24. 5 times I have received the 40 lashes minus 1, 3 times beaten with rods, one of those was Philippi, you might recall. Once I was pelted with stones, that was back in Lystra. 3 times I was shipwrecked, spent the night and the day in the open sea, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea. That's what he calls a slight momentary affliction. Only someone who has seen the glory of the risen Christ Jesus, which Paul had, and who had caught in a glimpse of eternal glories, could have written something like this, that his afflictions were slight and momentary compared to the glory that was awaiting him. So Paul preached in Corinth for some time, supported by Aquila and Priscilla, and then in due time Timothy and Silas came down from Macedonia, bringing some financial help from the church in Philippi. But in due time, some of the more traditional Jewish folks did not like Paul's message, and they dragged him before Gallio, There's the Acrocorinth in the background. This is the bema, and Gallio would have been seated here, Paul standing down here, and giving answer to these charges. A little bit nicer picture of the bema. So some of the Jewish folks who didn't like Paul's message about Jesus the Messiah were accusing him of, teaching against the law. And Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, dismisses the charges. And it's a little hard to understand when you just read Acts chapter 18, but when you know the context, it was a massive victory for Paul and for the gospel. Because what Gallio determined, what Gallio ruled, essentially, was that Christianity was a part of Judaism. It was a branch of Judaism, therefore enjoyed the legal protection that Judaism had had since the days of Julius Caesar. So a tremendous victory for Paul on his missionary journeys at this point, because that set precedent then for other Roman governors to also acknowledge Paul's right to preach and to teach. This is about 51 BC, or AD, 51 AD, and that ruling held all the way to about 64 AD, the time of Nero. Then the Roman government begins to distinguish between traditional Jews and Christians, and choosing, as you know, to persecute the Christians. But this gave Paul a great deal of breathing room, this ruling of Gallio here in 51 AD. Just one little picture here. You can see the Corinthian Gulf coming in from the west, and the Saronic Gulf from the east, and then the about 3.9 miles, and they actually had a nice little marble road there called the Diolkos, that goods were unloaded and quickly dragged across and then reloaded onto other ships. Sometimes you'll hear that smaller ships were dragged across on rollers. Some of our archaeological friends are telling us they're not quite so sure about that, so we don't press that too hard. But certainly most ships would have been unloaded, goods quickly transferred across and moving on. And of course, that kind of commerce always creates opportunities for workers and for food and for lodging and so forth. Part of the great prosperity, the booming prosperity of this town. We are on the Acrocorinth, as you may have guessed, looking down toward that Diolkos there. It gives you a good visual of the situation of this city. Later, the canal was dug, cut across, so the ships did not have to go around the Peloponnese, did not have to be loaded and unloaded, but the ships could simply sail right through the canal that replaced that Diolkos, that marble road I was talking about a moment ago. So this is a modern canal dug in the late 1800s, and you're wondering, the walls are about 250 feet. That wall is about 250 feet. The canal's about 80 feet wide at the bottom, not nearly large enough for super tankers today, but of course they have better navigational aids anyway to go around, but significant enough in Paul's day, not in Paul's day, significant enough in the 1880s when this was dug. So about 80 feet wide, and the water about 25 feet deep there. So, and this of course is the view from the land level looking down into the canal. This is from boat level, gives you a little sense of what the canal looks like at boat level. And for those of you who prefer all those statistics in metric, there they are for you, even the inclination of the walls. So, okay. Well, thanks for joining us. As my students used to say, every good slideshow ends with a sunset, and that is it right there. So, okay, well, thanks for joining us. We hope you have a chance to read through Acts chapter 18 again, Paul's ministry in Corinth, and you will get a lot more visuals, I think, to go with your reading when you read through Acts chapter 18 again. So, thanks for joining us. See you in a couple of weeks.